Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a young mother who was found in her home under strange circumstances. From the very first hours of the investigation, the police discovered some disturbing and chilling clues. Detectives faced many unexpected and bizarre twists, but eventually they managed to solve the case. Kathy Martin was born on October 25, 1959, in Houston, Texas. She grew up in a loving family and was very close to her sister. In high school, Kathy met a boy named Mike, and a few years later, they got married. The couple settled in a quiet suburb of Houston, and soon after their wedding, they had a daughter. 3 years later, Kathy became pregnant again, and in early 1987, they had a son. At that time, Kathy was 27 years old. After her second child was born, she spent all her time at home taking care of the kids. Mike worked at a small sign factory owned by Kathy's father, and the family had enough money to provide for their children. Kathy's parents also helped them financially, allowing her to dedicate all her time to the kids. On March 3, 1987, Kathy was at home with her children as usual, while Mike was at work. When his shift ended, he decided to meet up with some friends and headed to a bar. Mike called his wife from a payphone, but she didn't answer. This was unusual, as Kathy rarely had the opportunity to leave the house, even for a few minutes. Mike tried calling her several more times, but still got no response. Worried, he called their neighbor Tim and asked him to check on Kathy. Tim went to their house and knocked on the door, but no one answered. Looking through the living room window, he saw that the TV was on, so he kept knocking, but there was no response. Tim started to worry that something might have happened to Kathy. Instead of going back home to call Mike or the police, he got in his car and drove around town looking for patrol officers. After driving for a few minutes, he spotted a police car and explained the situation to the officers, asking them to check on Kathy. When the police arrived at the house and got no answer to their knock, they tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Entering the house, they immediately discovered Kathy's daughter on the living room sofa. She was unconscious, with visible signs of trauma, but still alive. The officers quickly called for an ambulance and continued to inspect the other rooms. In the bedroom, they found the younger child in his crib, safe and sound. But in another room, they were met with a horrifying sight. Kathy lay on the floor, covered in blood. She was naked, and the police immediately determined that she was dead. Her hands were also tied with a lamp cord. The paramedics took Kathy's daughter to the hospital, and the investigators began examining the crime scene. Soon after, Kathy's father arrived at the house, but the police didn't reveal all the details of what had happened. Instead, they asked him to go to the hospital to be with his granddaughter when she woke up. He complied, and while he was waiting at the hospital, he learned about his daughter's death from a news report on the TV. Meanwhile, Mike arrived at the house, and the police immediately noticed something strange. Besides the fact that he showed up quite late, there were several stains on his shirt that looked like blood. The police asked him to hand over his clothes and answer their questions. Meanwhile, investigators made some interesting discoveries. First, they found many bloodstains in the bathroom, indicating that the perpetrator had tried to clean up the crime scene. This suggested that the attacker had stayed in the house for some time instead of leaving immediately after the murder. Second, forensic experts found no signs of forced entry. All the windows and doors, except the front door, were locked. This indicated that Kathy either let the attacker in herself or they had a key. The police also noted another detail. All of Kathy's clothes were neatly folded on the floor next to her body. This not only suggested the possibility of sexual assault, but also seemed strange that the attacker had folded her clothes so carefully. The detectives assumed that the assailant might have threatened to harm her children if she screamed or refused to comply with his demands. Kathy might have agreed to do whatever they say, only to be killed afterward. Meanwhile, medics were fighting for Kathy's daughter's life. They determined that she had been severely beaten, likely with bare hands. After several hours in the hospital, she fell into a coma, and her chances of survival remained low. Medical experts examined Kathy's body and determined that she had received 16 stab wounds, primarily in the abdomen area. They also confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted and extracted biological material from the perpetrator. However, in those years, DNA analysis was not yet widely used in forensic science, so the experts could not extract a DNA profile from the semen. The best they could do was determine the perpetrator's blood type, so the biological material was sent to a lab. From the early hours of the investigation, the police began to focus their attention on the victim's husband. After noticing the suspicious stains on his shirt, they took his clothing for examination. Mike's behavior that evening also seemed strange. After work, he went out with friends, but instead of going home himself when he couldn't reach his wife, he asked a neighbor to check on her. Detectives had seen similar tactics before, where a husband committed the murder and created an alibi, such as going out with friends. Then, he would ask someone else to check on his wife to avoid being the one to find the body and divert suspicion from himself. Mike's involvement would also explain the lack of forced entry. Investigators began looking into whether he had the opportunity to commit the murder before meeting his friends. The detectives soon discovered something else. Mike had a criminal history. Right after high school, he was arrested for selling drugs to an undercover cop. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but served only 2 before being released on parole. Sometime later, he married Kathy. But despite this, the police needed more evidence to charge him. They also started investigating the neighbor, Tim, whose behavior seemed odd. Instead of calling the police from his home, he drove around town looking for patrol officers. The detectives also examined Tim's car and made an interesting discovery. There were suspicious stains on the floor mats that looked like blood, so they were also sent to the lab. Investigators began to wonder whether Mike and Tim could have committed the crime together or if one of them acted alone. Meanwhile, medical experts finished their report and reached an intriguing conclusion. They determined that Kathy had died around 1 p.m., about 6 hours before she was found. This meant the detectives now had to investigate where the suspects were long before the evening and what they did after the murder. Mike and Tim both claimed they were at work, so the police began verifying their alibis. Meanwhile, 2 days after the murder, they received a call from the hospital. Kathy's daughter had suddenly come out of her coma. Her life was no longer in danger, and investigators went to see her, hoping she could shed light on what had happened. But they quickly encountered a problem. The girl, who was only 4 years old at the time, had almost completely lost her memory of that day. All she could recall was a man with light hair entering their house. Both her father and Tim had dark hair, but the detectives didn't rush to rule them out as suspects. They considered the possibility that the girl's memory could be inaccurate due to the severe trauma she had suffered. They consulted with psychologists and asked them to work with the girl, hoping she might remember more details about the perpetrator. The detectives soon received a call from the lab, and there was another unexpected twist. The experts examined the evidence from the 2 suspects and found that the stains on the neighbor's car mats were machine oil, and the stains on the husband's shirt were just paint. But that wasn't all. Numerous colleagues of Mike and Tim, who worked at different jobs, confirmed that they had been at their workplaces all day and hadn't left until the evening. This meant neither man had the opportunity to be at Kathy's house and commit the crime. Detectives asked them to undergo polygraph tests, and the results showed no signs of deception in both cases. The police, who had been almost certain of the involvement of at least one of the 2 suspects, found themselves back at square one. They began considering other possible suspects who were familiar with the victim and could have got inside her house without difficulty. Detectives spoke with Kathy's relatives and friends, asking who they thought might have committed the crime. And soon they discovered something unexpected. Many of them, without any hesitation, named the same person: Greg. Greg was Kathy's brother-in-law, and her loved ones revealed that she had often complained about his behavior. According to Kathy, Greg openly flirted with her and had repeatedly tried to persuade the woman to engage in intimacy with him. Kathy also mentioned that Greg often made inappropriate comments about her stomach, and, as we know, most of the stab wounds were located in that area. The police also learned that Greg regularly used illegal substances and had a criminal history. Detectives began to focus on him and soon found their first potential lead. Forensic experts discovered a fingerprint in Kathy's house that matched Greg's, as well as a hair resembling his. However, there was a problem. Since Greg often visited Kathy and her husband, the fingerprint and hair could have been left there before the murder. Kathy's parents stated that they believed he was the murderer. Her mother also shared an interesting observation. While she was at the hospital with her granddaughter, Greg came to visit them in the middle of the night. As soon as the girl saw him, she looked at her grandmother, and judging by the expression on her face, she was very frightened. After Greg left, the grandmother asked if he was the man who had come to their house, but the girl said she still couldn't remember. After hearing all of this, the detectives called Greg in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder and said he was with a friend at the time, who also had lengthy criminal history. In the middle of the interrogation, Greg said he needed to go to the parking lot to pay for additional time to avoid a ticket. However, the man never returned to the station. His wife, Kathy's sister, recounted that on that day, Greg dropped her off at work around 10:30 in the morning and picked her up at 2:30 p.m. So, he had a 4-hour window that coincided with the time of the murder and provided him with the opportunity to kill Kathy. But despite all this, the police lacked any substantial evidence that could prove his involvement. As a last resort, they decided to analyze the semen sample taken from the victim's body. But in those years, experts could only determine the blood type of its owner. It would also require a large sample, and after conducting such a test, there would be very little biological material left for further examination. Nevertheless, the detectives decided to conduct this test, and the blood type of the sample's owner from Kathy's body matched Greg's blood type. However, this result also didn't prove his guilt, so investigators couldn't arrest him. They continued to search for other evidence, but they couldn't prove Greg's involvement. Eventually, the case hit a dead end. Kathy's family was convinced that Greg was the killer, but they couldn't do anything about it. Shelley, Kathy's sister, refused to believe that her husband did it and continued to live with him. In the following years, detectives revisited the case from time to time, hoping to find any new leads. In 1998, 11 years after the murder, they requested DNA analysis on the remaining semen sample. However, they faced another setback. Experts could only extract a partial DNA profile, which, when compared to Greg's DNA sample, yielded inconclusive results. The analysis showed that Greg belonged to the 2% of the population who could match the partial profile. Unable to arrest him based on this result, detectives once again called Greg in for questioning, telling him that the semen from the victim's body matched his DNA. To their surprise, Greg changed his initial statement, claiming that he had a consensual relationship with Kathy, and he indeed visited her on the day of the murder. But the man insisted that she was alive when he left. Detectives were obviously skeptical of Greg's sudden change in story. Such shifts are quite common in murder cases when suspects hear about DNA matches. Additionally, Kathy had complained about Greg's advances, feeling uncomfortable around him, so it was highly unlikely that she would have been in a secret relationship with him. But despite their suspicions, detectives knew they couldn't secure a conviction without a full DNA match. The local prosecutors reviewed the case and confirmed that obtaining a guilty verdict would be practically impossible, and the case once again went cold for several years. In 2002, detectives reopened the investigation and sought the help of forensic scientist Catherine Long, who was conducting groundbreaking DNA research at the time. She and her colleagues wanted to determine if genetic material from a perpetrator's hands could remain on the victim's body after strangulation, and if it could be extracted for analysis. To test this, Catherine and her colleagues simulated strangulation by squeezing each other's necks, then took samples from their hands and the neck area. The results were quite intriguing. Even brief interaction left behind enough skin particles for DNA analysis. The detectives working on Kathy's case became interested in their experiment. despite the fact that the victim had not been strangled. Re-examining her body years later was also not possible. Instead, they began reviewing all available evidence to see if the perpetrator could have come into contact with any other items. Their attention soon turned to the lamp cord used to bind Kathy's hands. It was evident that only the killer could have tightened it, as the victim herself simply could not have done so. The detectives handed over the cord to Catherine, who, along with her colleagues, began examining it. They first noted an important detail. The cord had been stored in a paper bag, allowing air to circulate and preventing moisture buildup, which could have compromised biological samples. Experts took swabs from the entire length of the cord, including the areas where traces of Kathy's blood remained. Upon analysis, they discovered 2 DNA profiles. The first, belonging to the victim, was expected, but the second profile perfectly matched Greg's DNA sample. That meant the detectives finally obtained strong evidence that Greg was the person who bound Kathy's hands, and therefore, he was the killer. Shortly thereafter, 15 years after the murder, the man was finally arrested. During interrogation, he refused to admit his guilt, insisting that he had a romantic relationship with Kathy. The detectives obviously didn't believe him, and, armed with the DNA evidence, decided to take the case to court. While awaiting trial, Greg was placed in prison. Sometime later, the detectives received an interesting call. His cellmate reached out to them, claiming that Greg had confessed to him. According to the cellmate, Greg boasted about assaulting and killing his wife's sister in detail. He said that on the day of the incident, Greg took illegal substances and went to Kathy's house. Once inside, he attempted to coerce her into an intimate encounter, but she resisted and demanded he leave. Greg then approached her daughter and inflicted a series of severe blows on her. After that, he told Kathy that if she didn't do everything he wanted, he would kill her son. Kathy, who had no other choice, agreed to protect her children. Greg tied her up, assaulted her, and killed her, inflicting numerous stab wounds. He then washed the blood off himself in the bathroom and changed into her husband's clothes to avoid getting blood in his own car. The detectives had no doubt about the truthfulness of the cellmate's words, as he couldn't have possibly guessed so many key details, even if he had read about the case in the news. Armed with the cellmate's testimony, the detectives confronted Greg, and this time, he finally confessed. He admitted to killing Kathy and repeated everything he had told his cellmate. In 2004, he pleaded guilty before the judge and received a 45-year prison sentence. However, he only served 4 years and died of liver cancer at the age of 56. Kathy's husband, Mike, didn't live to see the killer's arrest. He passed away at the age of 45. Kathy's children and parents thanked the detectives for bringing the case to a close, even though it took 15 years. All this time, they were almost certain that Greg was the murderer and had to watch him continue to live with their second daughter, but couldn't do anything about it. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.